Hello, fellow systems engineers. Welcome back to another episode of the MBSE podcast. This time we have a very special guest. We have Mr. SysML, also known as Sandy Friedenthal. He has been one of the leaders and driving forces behind the language since the early days of SysML v1, and it was a great honor to work with him on SysML v2. And we are very happy that he takes the time to have us. And we are having a hopefully great exchange, and we think you got a ton of questions for SysML v2. We had some other sessions with other people like at Seidewitz, and this time we will talk a little bit more about the application. But Sandy, before we talk too much, please introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, Christian. Good evening, I guess, where you are. I'm Sandy Friedenthal. I worked at Lockheed Martin for my last portion of my career, and I left there in 2000 at the end of 2010, and I started my own consulting. While I was at Lockheed, I basically grew up as a system engineer, and over the last several years, I led up their model-based systems engineering initiative. They called it model-based system development at the time. And I helped the organizations across Lockheed and the various projects within those organizations. I helped them in terms of their adoption of MBSE. And we introduced SysML starting back in 2006, 5, 6, 7 timeframe. Over that period of time, I've continued to work on evolving the standard, worked through the SysML RTF, SysML version 1 RTF, helped kickstart SysML v2, and here we are today with as we begin transitioning towards SysML v2.
Yeah, great. So thanks, Chandy, and great that you're here in our show. And well, 2 weeks ago, SysML v2 was adopted at the OMG meeting in Washington or Reston. So many people ask me, what actually does adoption mean? So is it already there? Is it final? Is it released? Can we use SysML v2? So please tell us a bit about what happened at the OMG meeting and what adoption means.
Okay, thanks, Tim. So basically, the way the OMG process works, the object management group, is they issue an RFP, and that's done through the OMG. And the RFP contains the requirements, in this case, for SysML v2. So define what is it we want from the language. So it took a few years to develop those requirements. And that was issued back in 2017, December of 2017. The RFP, came out, was approved by the OMG. And then a submission team takes those requirements and develops a response to those requirements. And they develop a submission. And the submission basically is the specification for the language. So they take the initial requirements that are in the RFP, and they try and develop a specification for the language, which tool vendors can then implement. So the SysML v2 submission team was formed back in December 2017, right after the RFP came out. And at that, what they did is they basically came and submitted that set of specifications to the OMG and for adoption. So what happened at Reston a couple of weeks ago is the SysML v2 submission team submitted the specifications for what they called their final submission. And the intent was for the OMG to approve it and basically adopt it. But this initial adoption is as a beta specification. So what it means is the OMG now has the specification. It is in their hands at this time. It has to go through a couple more wickets before it becomes an actual beta specification. And then it enters this finalization phase where basically tool vendors have an opportunity to raise implementation issues against the beta specification. And and then the finalization task force, which are part of the OMG, then address those issues. And this results in a update to the specifications, which then gets basically submitted to the OMG with a final report, gets approved, and at that point, it becomes a formally adopted spec. So I said a lot of things, but bottom line is what happened last week, a week and a half ago, is we started the process of this becoming a beta specification, which is approved by the OMG, and entering the finalization phase. And in approximately a year and a half from now, sometime in 2024, we expect this beta spec to become a formally adopted specification, updated and reflect that formally adopted specification. Long answer, but that's what the process is.
Okay, great. Yeah, Sandy, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the SST phase when the users were formulating requirements to the language. How could users influence the language, the new language?
Well, the users were responsible for developing the requirements that went into that RFP. So that was a 2 to 3 year process, really a little bit longer than that, to be honest, where we had, it was primarily driven by users within in COSI and the OMG working together through the System Engineering Domain Special Interest Group, which is part of the OMG. But they worked together to define what are the requirements for this language. So it was driven from the beginning through those requirements, which were completely come from the user. Once the RFP was issued and the SysML submission team was formed, we had good representation from the user community, as well as from tool vendors, as well as from academia and others. But we had good representation from the user community to take the requirements that were in the RFP and continue to validate them, meaning make sure that they reflected what the users really wanted in those requirements. And then as the language progressed, as the language design progressed in response to the requirements, the users had an opportunity to then take the language as designed and as implemented in a pilot implementation to then validate that in fact they were getting what they expected. So it's a user-driven process from the beginning. We formulated the requirements, and then as the language evolved, as the language design evolved, we had an opportunity to basically validate we were getting what we asked for and provide that feedback.
Yeah, great.
Sometimes the UML and the SysML v1 were criticized for being developed by a committee, which is wrong, I think. But this time we explicitly integrated the users into the process, or much stronger than before. Who were the users of, for example, from which domains did the users come?
So first of all, I'm not sure, being involved with the development of SysML v1, I wouldn't agree it was developed by committee. We had a pretty good structure there, but I mean, that's fair criticism. It may appear that way, but it wasn't. But at any rate, with respect to v2, when you ask what domain do the users come from, they typically are, most of them are representatives from organizations that are part of the OMG, and there's a large number of user organizations. For example, company that I used to work for, Lockheed, we had, Lockheed had representation on this, and a lot of other companies had representation. In fact, there was something like, over the 5+ years that we worked on this, there were over 200 people that participated in the development of this specification, coming from, I think, over 80 different organizations. So we had a lot of different user representatives, some of them very active all the way through, some came and gone, but we had good inputs. In addition, if I might add, we did conduct a couple of different times. We certainly communicated through NCOSI to the broader systems engineering community, and we conducted a user validation review. I think we did 2 of those that were, I think we had something like 400 people participate. It was done online, and we walked through the language. So we really tried to engage the users. We had other mechanisms as well. So anyway.
Yeah. So now SysML v2 is adapted. Can I already use SysML v2 in practice? Does it make sense to start with SysML v2 already in projects? Or?
What makes sense to do is to start thinking about the transition to SysML v2. From if you're a current v1 user, then you would be transitioning from SysML v1 to SysML v2. Or if you haven't been a SysML v1 user, it's still an opportunity to start thinking about transitioning from your current practice to a model-based system engineering practice with v2. And what we have available to us right now, at least in terms of the open community, is there is the pilot implementation that was developed as part of the SysML v2 submission effort. Ed Seidewitz led that. He's a co-lead on SysML v2. And the pilot implementation is a rigorous implementation of the specification. It doesn't have a lot of fancy user interface or anything like that, but it's a rigorous implementation, and people can use it. A couple of different ways in which you can, a couple of different environments in which you can use this pilot implementation. So my suggestion would be for people to start using the pilot implementation in advance of the vendors coming out with their tools, and get familiar with SysML v2 and start trying to understand the implications and the impact it would have on your modeling practices and the like. And so that you can do right here and right now. No, I think it would be too early for a project to actually start using SysML v2. We want to wait till we have commercially available vendor tools, I would say. But no reason not. I think it's important to start now, get familiar with the language, and basically assessing its implications on your overall practices. So that's what I would recommend.
Okay.
Yeah, speaking of commercially available tools, what is your opinion on SysML v2? Will it change the tool landscape, or will there be the same 4 or 5 big modeling tool vendors, or is there space for new startups?
Well, I think there clearly will be the current SysML v1 vendors. I anticipate that, and have reason to believe that most of those will be developing SysML v2 modeling tools. But I do think others will join, maybe large companies, maybe startups. I've seen indications of that. So I do think it's going to change the landscape. And I would say not only in terms of the SysML v2 modeling tools, but because SysML v2 includes the standardized API, I think that's going to motivate an awful lot of other software, other tool vendors, if you will, to look for ways to integrate with the SysML v2 modeling tool through the API and be part of the broader digital engineering ecosystem. And I anticipate really substantial increases in the number of applications that will be talking to SysML v2 tools. So I think we'll see that change in the landscape.
Yeah, I think a good example is Tom Sawyer. No? They only provide a visualization tool, which is great. So things like that.
Yeah, I think you're
Uh,
going to see, sorry, I would just elaborate by saying I think you'll see more analysis tools trying to integrate with SysML v2, more CAD tools, more PLM tools, configuration management, all kind, and as well as things like you mentioned, visualization, graph visualization tools like Tom Sawyer and others. But I really think there's just many opportunities for this.
yeah, yeah. So, well, companies have invested a lot of money, time in SysML v1, no? So tools, training, guidelines, etc., etc. And now we come with the SysML v2. So how can projects migrate from SysML v1 to SysML v2? So what are their options?
Well, I think what I mentioned before about starting this transition process, this is an opportunity to improve your practice. And I think we shouldn't think of this as just a language change and you're just moving from one language to another, but rather as an opportunity to substantially improve your practice. And you could do this incrementally. But I think what SysML v2 does is it puts you on another level where your ability to evolve can be at a very different rate, much higher rate than your ability to evolve with v1. I think there's so much opportunity going into the future. So view this initial step as just putting yourself sort of on this next level of the platform, and then being in a position where you can evolve your practice and make substantial improvements, and not only in terms of capability, but in terms of quality. And I would like to emphasize the quality aspect because, I see a lot of SysML v1 models, and, to be honest, it's mixed. The quality is very mixed. And I think we all ought to think about this as an opportunity to move to this a much higher level of quality. And then from there, look at advancing your practice. There are just many things that we're going to be able to do with v2 that we could not realistically do with v1. Just to name, one example, I think we'll see because SysML v2 is much more precise, that we'll have the opportunity, and it's got this semantic foundation, that we'll have the ability to apply reasoning that we tried to do with v1, but we were quite limited. I think we're going to be able to apply analysis in terms of sort of logical reasoning about our models at a new level. That's not going to happen overnight, but we'll be able to start taking advantage of some of the reasoning tools out there and do some very sophisticated things. That may not be for everybody, but I think for some, that may turn out to be incredibly important. And that's just one example. Integrating with more traditional engineering analysis, I think we're going to be able to do a much better job with that as well. Many opportunities to really take some significant steps in your MBSE practice.
Yeah. So when you speak of the practice or practicing of SysML v2, that it sounds like it's getting easier, and there are a lot of low-hanging fruits that people are able to gather in a very easy way. Is this impression true? And how is it different to SysML v1?
Low-hanging fruit. It's a good question. I think the first low-hanging fruit may be to take your existing models and make them clearer and just make them more understandable. So I would say that's the initial low-hanging fruit. I think the next higher hanging fruit will be to improve your methodologies and be able to take advantage of this language. I think we barely started to explore that. But for example, I envision that with SysML v2, there are opportunities to do collaborative modeling that we didn't have with v1. I have particular reasons for saying that. It's a little hard to describe in a few words here, but I do think that there will be a lot of opportunity to really improve collaborative modeling. What does that ultimately mean? It means that different, whether you're different subsystems working on the model, or whether you're different discipline engineers, reliability engineer, security engineer, performance focused, whatever it is, you all can go on and work, if you will, more concurrently. So it's really a form of concurrent engineering, where you're working concurrently on the model and not tripping over yourselves, but working collaboratively, doing your part of the modeling and being able to integrate it into the whole in a more effective way. None of this is easy. This is all going to require, significant looks at our methodologies, our modeling practices, and discipline system engineering. But these are all opportunities. If we are able to successfully do that, then we start to realize the promise of what we used to call years ago concurrent engineering, which is where you can really, speed up the process, get quality in the design, and all of these kind of things, and, address downstream considerations earlier in the process, and avoid having to do rework later. All of those kind of benefits that you could potentially get if we can take advantage of this language and improve our methodologies and bring the discipline to this next level.
Okay. So sometimes I hear that people, they are a little bit worried because, the output of the SST team, the specification looks very complicated for people who are not familiar with beta modeling and so. And then they see the textual notation, which, on the first view, if you're not familiar with programming, it looks also very complicated. So what do you think? Is SysML v2 easier to learn than SysML v1 for an engineer, or is it more complicated for?
So the way I've responded to that is I believe, SysML v2 there's a lot there. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to learn the whole language real quickly. Let's put it that way. But what you can do is I think you can get to a base level capability quickly. I really believe that. Now, we haven't had enough experience to prove that yet. We don't have tools, for example, that we can use. We have the pilot implementation. I've done some, informal introductions of the language to people who, in some cases, had very little experience with SysML, in other cases, more experience. And I can see that learning process is quite quick to get to that base level. So I think you'll be able to get to a base level of capability fairly quickly, be productive on a program pretty quickly. Of course, you'll need some level of support, but the language is much less idiosyncratic than SysML v1. It doesn't have as many of these idiosyncrasies and exceptions. It's more regular. Mm-hmm. And as a result, I think you'll find it easier to learn once you get a handle on some of the basic patterns of the language. So you learn it quickly. Now, once you get to that point, it may take, it's going to be over time, then you can evolve your understanding and take advantage of more and more features of the language. But that's my thinking, and my hope is that we'll be able to get to that first level quickly.
Okay, and is it an advantage if I'm already a SysML v1 practitioner?
Yes, I think so, because the concepts at one level are quite, at least some of the core concepts are very similar. I mean, that notions of behavior and structure and requirements and those kind of concepts, which you're very familiar with as a SysML v1 user, carry over directly into SysML v2. The only difference is, again, it's more regular. So you'll see this regular pattern and you'll find it actually, frankly, it'll be quite satisfying to move from V1 to V2 and see those differences. So if you know V1, I think you'll be able to pick up V2 fairly quickly. There will be some things you may scratch your head about a little bit here and there initially, but then as you use it a bit, you'll say, oh, okay. And that's only because you're used to SysML V1, and in SysML V2, there are clearly differences that you'll need to get familiar with.
Can you name some of the main differences between SysML V2 and SysML V1?
So I think the one, well, yes. So I guess from a user perspective,
Yes.
First, you'd see the fact that we do have the textual syntax along with the graphical syntax. So we have both, and they're complementary. They're just different renderings, different concrete syntax for the same underlying model, the same underlying abstract syntax and semantics, but different concrete syntax. So you can look at something textually, you can look at it graphically. I expect the tools to support, if you make a change in the graphical notation, it would change the textual. If you change the textual, it changes the graphical. So those two should stay in sync. That's my expectation from the tools, because they are literally representations of the same underlying model. Okay, so that's one of the obvious first differences, and can discuss what that does for you, but that's a big difference. The other big difference for, kind of sticks out right away is this notion of the definition and usage pattern. And this is in my opinion, a huge improvement. And we go from, this notion of definition and usage was in SysML V1. We referred to it, but it was informal. It wasn't, per se part of the language. The definition and usage concept was there. For example, we considered block a definition element and a part property a usage of that block. And you could have many different usages for the same definition. So you only had to define things once and you could use it many times, and that's a great thing. But it was applied inconsistently in SysML V1. For example, a part and a block, that's a usage and a definition. And we had action and activity, and we had other things that were in effect similar in the pattern, but they actually didn't work the same. Move over to V2, definition and usage is applied consistently across all the language concepts, and it's a consistent pattern. And once you use that, you learn that basic pattern, it applies to virtually everything, whether it's parts or ports or actions or requirements or constraints or this or that or what have you. So across the language, you can apply this definition and usage pattern, and it provides all kinds of really nice benefits, starting with the fact that it's just regular and less idiosyncratic than you had in V1, as I mentioned before. There's many other differences in the language. If you go through, concept by concept, there's, and it would take a long time to go through all the differences, but, requirements are more rigorously defined. We had the notion of, for example, property-based requirements that were introduced in SysML V1 in a non-normative annex. Well, they were designed into the language in SysML V2. So we have any requirement not only includes a shall statement like you would expect, but you can also specify a constraint expression as part of the requirement that can then be evaluated through analysis to see whether you met the requirement or not, as an example. But there are literally, a host of very substantial changes, which I would call them virtually all significant improvements in the language. And we need time to go through those, and we'll work on that over time to make that available. I'll just finish by noting that we do have some training material that came out of the SysML V2 submission team, and there's both textual training material and graphical training material. In the graphical training material, which is available open source, goes through the different concepts, and you'll see what we call a V2 marker. And that V2 marker identifies something that's different in V2 than was in V1. So it's a good source to start seeing a lot of the differences.
Okay. Coming back to the textual syntax, now that's, well, one of the most significant changes. I talked to many people, mainly software engineers, so systems engineers who were software engineers, that they would like to use it like source code. So they would like to skip the underlying model. They have the textual syntax, and then they check in their model, the text files in GitHub, and that's it. So it's not an intended use, but if you don't need the benefits of an underlying model, it works. It's a little bit the way the pilot implementation works at the moment. So what do you think about those approaches? I'm pretty sure they will come up, but I'm not sure if it's a good way.
Well, I think it's up to the modeler to decide how they, what works for them. I mean, some people, if you come from a software development background, by the way, I do not, but I actually really like the textual syntax. But if you come from a software development background, I would assume the textual syntax will be very natural. If you come from a system engineering background, like I said, I don't come from a software development. I've developed software for simulations and things like that in years past, but I find the textual syntax to be, I believe it's very intuitive for the most part. There are places where it's not, but for the most part, it's fairly straightforward. I mean, if you're creating a part hierarchy, you have a part and then a bracket, and then you have an indentured part that's nested within the part, and another part and another part, and then you can nest parts within that. So you have a parts tree. It looks like a parts tree. So it's very straightforward in many cases. But I think what people will find, I believe, is that the combination of graphical and textual, they really are complementary. When you're looking at a piece of the system, a cohesive piece, the textual syntax is a very efficient way to look at it. And got examples even in the graphical syntax where you look at it and you say, gosh, that's easier to look at textually. It's clear, it's more compact and more precise. On the other hand, if you're looking at cross-cutting relationships that span the system, that cross-cut the system, the graphical syntax is really critical. I can't start to look at a large model in a textual form and make sense out of it. I need the graphical representation to understand the system. So I think people will find the combination to be very useful. That's my sense.
Yeah. Okay.
Coming back on learning the language, is there already other ideas for a certification program for SysML v2, or will OMG handle that somehow?
I think there's definitely interest in a certification program. I think one of the challenges we have with the SysML v1 certification program is very hard to keep it current. Keep it current with the standard. The standard evolves. Probably every 2 years, there was a new revision to SysML. And it was very challenging. Frankly, the certification program was not able to keep up. It's expensive in both dollars and time, resources, people, in terms of developing the questions, in terms of validating the questions, all of this, and getting a good statistical response so it's a meaningful certification. All of this was really challenging aspect of SysML v1. I'm hoping that we rethink the approach to certification in v2. I consider it to be critical because people, as part of this quality effort that I mentioned before about getting quality in our models, we need to make sure that the modelers themselves are in fact certified to use this language. So I think that's going to be important, but we have to address this issue with how to keep it current, because I anticipate that v2 will evolve perhaps even more quickly than v1 did. that there will be evolutions in terms of the language itself will be stable, but I think there'll be new capabilities that get added to the language. For example, there'll be new domain-specific extensions and things like that. So we need a way to keep that certification up to date. I saw even at the last meeting that they're starting to talk about it, so it will happen. But that's going to take time.
Yeah. Okay, so, wow, time is up again. It felt fast again, and we could talk longer about SysML v2. But well, I guess we will do more episodes about the new language in the future. So, yeah, thank you, Sandy, to be here in our show. And well, our next topic this time is already set. We will talk about, or we have an episode from our series MBSE Around the World, and this time we visit France with Raphael Faudou. I hope I spelled his name correctly. He was one of the MBSE co-chairs of the French chapter of Incosi. And it will be April 26th, the same time. And well, finally, do not forget,
Trust us, we are systems engineers.